Hey class, just wanted to put up the final review video that I'm going to be providing during this, April period of school closure. Um, this one goes hand in hand with the review schedule that you should have received from the school, and it's going to pretty much focus on like early presidents and early American government. Effective Monday, April 20th. We will be going to new instruction, and we'll start pushing through with the curriculum and moving away from review. I will be updating the Google Classrooms every morning with assignments for you all to do during the day. So please feel free to check in on there. If you have any questions, send me an email, PALTHOUSE, P-Althouse, at ecs.k12.ny.us. That's palthouse at ecs.k12.ny.us. I hope that this finds everybody well here on Monday, April 13th. And let me jump into the material. Just excuse me as I look away because I want to. I have a PowerPoint over here that I want to go through. So first and foremost, we talk about early presidents in U.S. government. We kind of start with a spillover from the Constitution, and we get into the whole idea of the unwritten Constitution. Remember, the unwritten Constitution. The Constitution is our plan of government, and the whole unwritten piece. Well, what does that imply? So, essentially, the unwritten Constitution are practices of our government that occur daily. They're simply not written into that document. And there's three examples that we've referred to. Political parties, the presidential cabinet, and lobbyists. If you remember political parties, like in today's day and age, we live in the day and age of Democrats and Republicans, right? We have a two-party system, which pretty much dominates American politics. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. The presidential cabinet, positions like Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Interior, all things that you hear about as you pay attention to American politics. There's nothing in the Constitution about the presidential cabinet except the fact it does take place in government on a daily basis. And last but not least, lobbyists. Lobbyists are people who try to influence government. Groups that try to persuade government to pass law and legislation that benefits them. Examples: health insurance companies, oil companies, the National Rifle Association, labor unions, just to name a couple. So those are all aspects of this unwritten Constitution. So they're part of government, but they're not written into the plan. The next piece we got into were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. These were the first two political parties really in American history, and really their name kind of gives it away, right? The Federalists favored a stronger federal government, whereas the Anti-Federalists were more in favor and power, the power being rested in the hands of the states. The Federalists love the Elastic Clause. The reason they like the Elastic Clause is because it allows Congress to pass any law they consider necessary and proper. The Anti-Federalists feared the Elastic Clause because they felt that it was going to allow the federal government to have too much power and essentially take away rights. That was one of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists insisted upon a Bill of Rights being added to the U.S. Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were also the ones who wanted to see America, remain more an agricultural nation, whereas the Federalists, wanted to see America start to industrialize as a country. Henceforth, the Federalists, who wanted industry, they liked the tariff because the tariff taxed imports and helped American industry. The Anti-Federalists were not pro-industry, so they were not advocates and fans of the tariff. Remember, a tariff was a tax on imports. Needless to say, when we got done covering that material in the year, we then shifted gear and we talked about George Washington. George Washington. We're going to focus on the relevant facts. Remember, I said that earlier to you guys. He was the first president of the United States, so he had no example to follow. He set the examples that future presidents have followed. Some of the examples of the precedents, or the examples of precedent, is an example that people who come after you follow that example. Some of the precedents or examples that he set were, he used a cabinet. Every president since him has used a cabinet. He also only did 2 terms as president of the United States. Remember, each presidential term is 4 years, so he did a total of 8 years, and then he left the office of the presidency. And that precedent, or that example, was legitimately followed all the way through, FDR, who would run for a 3rd and a 4th term. Then in 1951, the Constitution was amended, the 22nd Amendment, and presidents can only do 2 terms. So once you get elected that second time, you can never run for a third term because it's in the Constitution. And last but not least, he established a foreign policy of neutrality and isolation, which would last approximately 100 years. That would last from roughly the 1790s to the 1890s. A couple other concepts we talked about in regard to George Washington. It would be during his presidency where the Federalists would control Washington. They would control the legislative branch, and they would essentially push through a bunch of legislation. They would get that tariff that I mentioned, that tax on imports, right? They got an excise tax on whiskey. An excise tax is when you tax the sale, the manufacture, distribution of a product. Whiskey was popular. They taxed it to help get America out of debt, and they also created a national bank to control America's finances. These were all ideas which Alexander Hamilton, the leader of the Federalists, was a proponent of. And he got Congress, the legislative branch, to pass these bills and have them become laws. Then Washington signed them. Washington also had Jefferson in his cabinet. Jefferson was the leader of the Anti-Federalists. And remember, he was not a fan of those ideas. But the beauty of that is that Washington really got to hear both opinions, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist opinion, with Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury, the leader of the Federalists, and Jefferson as the Secretary of State, the leader of the Anti-Federalists. One big thing that would kick up at this time would be the Whiskey Rebellion. Many farmers, most notably in western Pennsylvania, did not like the excise tax on whiskey. So they would lead a rebellion against it. Now, if you think about this, we fought the revolution over taxes. Now here under the Constitution, you have an unpopular tax and you have a rebellion. So George Washington is the president who's responsible for enforcing laws. Decision to make. Do I put down the rebellion, or do we give in, to these angry Americans? Well, he essentially did put down the rebellion, and that really sets the precedent. That this new government under the Constitution means business, and we will enforce our laws if people like them or not. We then shifted gears. We started talking about John Adams, the second president of the United States, and we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and we got into we revisited the idea of supremacy. Remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts were federal law passed with the Elastic Clause. Congress thought it was necessary and proper to pass this federal law. The problem with the Alien and Sedition Acts is they kind of limited free speech. And so the Constitution, up on top of federal law, right, supremacy, basically states that you can't limit free speech. So you had the Constitution saying free speech, federal law limiting free speech, and then down here where my thumb is, you had states basically saying, well, we're not going to follow that federal law. We're going to nullify or get rid of that federal law. None of this is supposed to happen. I mean, this is a constitutional supremacy mess. But here we are, 10 years into the history of the country, and supremacy is kind of getting thrown out of the window. And that was one of the things we talked about, the Adams presidency. We then got into Thomas Jefferson and the whole idea of loose versus strict interpretation of the Constitution. A strict interpretation of the Constitution is you follow it word by word. If the Constitution says it, it can be done. If it doesn't say it, you can't. A loose interpretation is more along the Federalist perspective. Just because the Constitution doesn't say it doesn't mean we can't do it, because the Elastic Clause allows Congress to pass any law they consider necessary and proper. Any law they consider necessary and proper, so they can essentially do what they must. And with that, when we got into Jefferson, we talked about the Louisiana Purchase. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president can authorize the purchase of land, but Jefferson does it anyway. It doubles the size of the United States. He basically equated it to the ability of the president to sign a treaty, and he did it because it was beneficial for our country. This is really the one time during his presidency where he went away from that strict interpretation. Remember, Thomas Jefferson, was the leader of the early Anti-Federalist Party, which would go on to become the Democratic-Republican Party, and he went against his party principles because now he's leading the country to do what was best for the U.S. We got into briefly how Lewis and Clark would explore the Louisiana Territory to bring back information. The other big issue which we covered under Jefferson's presidency was the Marbury versus Madison case. This was that case which established judicial review. This is where the Supreme Court really steps up and flexes its muscle and says, you know what, if Congress passes a law which we consider unconstitutional, we will strike it down. We will review that law and we will declare it unconstitutional. And this really cements the Supreme Court as kind of like an equal player in early government. Kind of up to this point, they didn't necessarily have the relevance that the legislative branch and the executive branch had. And that's the case which we've referred to, throughout the course when we talk about, whether it be, Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court said, slavery is constitutional and you can't take away one's property. At that time in 1857, they used judicial review and they declared that as constitutional. We talked about the World War I, the Schenck versus United States case, where the Supreme Court said, it's okay to take away free speech if that free speech creates a clear and present danger. That is constitutional. So, just a couple examples of the Supreme Court using judicial review, reviewing law and saying what is allowed under the Constitution and what's not. Some of the last couple ideas which we discussed were the Monroe Doctrine, which basically, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 basically just reasserted that foreign policy established by George Washington, that we would stay isolated. We would stay in the Americas, and we would stay out of, European affairs. We were going to isolate ourselves over here and focus in the Americas. We weren't going to get involved in conflicts on the other side of the world. And that's just really an 1823 doctrine, which is a presidential foreign policy statement that supports that initial foreign policy established by Washington. We talked about John Marshall and his Supreme Court decisions, and in there, we got into how it was the Supreme Court decisions under John Marshall, decisions like Marbury versus Madison, which strengthened the power of the federal government, decisions like McCulloch versus Maryland, where, the Supreme Court basically told the state of Maryland, you can't use your state power to tax and destroy a national bank. The state kind of got put in its place by the federal government. Cases like Dartmouth v. Woodward, where the Supreme Court basically told the state of New Hampshire, you can't take over a private college, and the state got shot down by the federal government. Gibbons v. Ogden, where the federal government basically tells the state of New York, we regulate interstate commerce. The federal government regulates commerce or business between states, not the state of New York. And I think the final example which we used there was the Worcester v. Georgia case, in which the Supreme Court told the state of Georgia, you cannot require, your law, which required the Cherokee to have license to remain on their independent sovereign land, you can't do that. So in all these examples, all because of judicial review, the Supreme Court kind of flexes its muscle, and the strength of the federal government is really, increased because of these court decisions. And then last but not least, we talked about in the early 1800s how America slowly but surely started to industrialize and have this industrial revolution, or this change in American economy. And that industrial revolution would take place over the course of the 1800s. And you remember, before the school closure, it was back in February, we were discussing, the impact of the industrial revolution. It would be in the late 1800s and the early 1900s where America would become an industrial power. But those seeds kind of get planted in these early years of government. I hope this helps. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email. I put that in the beginning of this video. And I'm here to help you however I can. I hope this finds everybody doing well. Take care.